We certainly need to reopen. We need to do it safely. I think we ought to be following the advice of the medical experts and the professionals. But as soon as possible, I think we do need to get America back to work, get the economy moving again. People need to put food on the table, and they got to work to do that. So, yeah, we need to reopen it, but do it safely.
Yeah, how do you balance that with the talk of a second wave of this, with this not going away, we don't have a vaccine? How do you balance those two things out?
It is a balancing act. You want to do it soon, but you also want to do it safely. I think our governor, Mike DeWine's been a leader in making decisions like this. On the task force relative to reopening the government from Washington, we've had guidelines, but we basically have left it up to the states to make their decision on a state-by-state basis. Obviously, rural Mississippi is very different from Manhattan, so the way they reopen is going to be different.
What do you think the biggest successes of the government in battling this have been, and the biggest failures of the government have been?
It's hard. Some of the successes and the things which aren't as close, as you'd like them to be. Testing, obviously, a lot of tests have happened. We need even more. We've literally run out of the important materials. And one of those reasons is because we're too dependent on countries like China that don't necessarily have our best interests in mind. Our small businesses are hurting all over the country. I think the PPP program, for example, is really helping a lot of people. But the government really isn't set up to do this many loans this fast. So their successes, some people would define them as success. Other people would say those very successes are failures. So it's.
I was just on Senator Portman's conference call, and he was talking about how he'd like to make 2 or 3 tweaks to it. He couldn't do it because they didn't have an in-person vote, but he'd like to lift that cap on you can only spend 25% of it on expenses versus your salary.
Yeah.
And then also being able to pick which 6 weeks you get the money for, get the money for, instead of just getting it right away because you haven't opened it. How do you feel about those?
Those are 2 of the things that I've heard the most complaints across the country from small businesses.
Can you say what those complaints are?
Yeah. The challenge is that businesses are told that they've got 8 weeks to pay their employees, yet their employees can't come back to work. The state has still closed a lot of those businesses, so they're out of sync. In addition to that, of the PPP money that small businesses are spending, they have to spend 75% of that on payroll. And all businesses are a little different. That works for some businesses, but not for others.
Okay. Any other examples of something you think is working really well and something you need to work better?
Those are the 2 main ones, really, that we mentioned.
Okay. There's been some talk that the president is trying to get public schools to reopen before the end of this school year, and the governors are pushing back. Where do you stand on that? Should schools be reopening before the fall?
Well, it's up to the states and the local school boards, in my view. It ought not to be a one-size-fits-all because states and communities are different. We'd like to get the kids back in school. On the other hand, we want to make sure that they're safe. They are the most precious things that we have. Of course, they have been probably one of the least vulnerable groups. It's older folks, especially those with underlying health conditions, who have been the most vulnerable. So, we want to get our kids back in school, but we want to do it safely.
And I know this is more of a state issue than a federal issue, but we're hearing more and more Ohio's prisons have become a huge hotspot.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can do, or anything you're hearing from your constituents about people in prison, especially like Marion and Pickaway, where they have thousands of positive cases?
Yeah.
What can you do, or what have you been doing?
Yeah. Well, it's not surprising when you have that many people in that close of an environment that you're going to have the spread of a disease like this that is very communicable from one person to another. So we do have to protect that population, oftentimes from each other. It can be brought in from a staff person, it can be brought in by a new inmate. So they are certainly a part of our society who needs to be protected.
How much further do you think the federal government should go to help states and local governments?
I think we absolutely do need to help those folks at the local level, at the state level, with police departments and their fire services, the first responders, the healthcare workers. Unfortunately, it wasn't in this last spending bill that we made, although we did spend $150 billion for state and local government in a previous bill. So it's something I've certainly heard from the local elected officials here in our community, and we do want to help them. I mean, they need the help, and we certainly do want to help them.
What kind of parameters should be put on that health bill? Obviously there's the discussions, especially for Ohio cities where they're relying on income and sales tax. Mm-hmm. But there's also worries nationally that it'll help other places with their pension problems and things like that. Where do you think the line should be? Well,
what the federal government needs to decide and work on is making sure that we take care of the legitimate expenses, the police and fire, additional hospitalization and health care issues, which are legitimate, and they ought to get some federal help. On the other hand, we don't want to bail out bad decisions on pensions in states like Illinois, for example, who have made bad decisions over the years.
And finally, do you think the nation is prepared for a second wave of coronavirus?
We certainly want to avoid that if at all possible, and that's why, as we're reopening, we need to do it in a smart, responsible way. We don't want to have another spike. Whether or not that's going to occur obviously remains to be seen, but we want to avoid that if at all possible.
Understood that we want to avoid it, but do you think if it did happen, we're prepared? Do we have the equipment and now knowing what it is, do you think we can combat it better if it comes back at us?
Well, one would hope that a second time around we'd be better prepared for it, but we certainly don't want to face that if we can do the right things now and avoid it. So that ought to be our goal, is to avoid a second round from happening at all.
So we're asking all of our area congressional delegations basically the same questions for a roundup that we're doing as you guys eventually head off to work, although you were going to go on Monday, but that's not going to happen. Any reaction on that?
Well, I think we should get to work. Even if they don't have a bill to vote on, we should be having hearings right now in the committees of jurisdiction about the virus and about the economic relief.
Do you think that can be done virtually, or do you think it needs to be done in person?
Oh, I absolutely think we can do this remotely. Look, we're telling every school child in the United States right now to go to school online. Banks are transferring billions of dollars today. And if Congress can't figure out how to work online, then we need a new set of congressmen.
Is it time for the country to reopen?
The country needs to reopen immediately. The consequences of shutting our economy down are going to be felt. They're going to come quick. We're going to have shortages in the stores here pretty soon if we don't get this economy open.
How do you do that and also balance the need of public health and public safety?
Well, our governor is saying in 2 weeks you can go back to work if you wear a mask. Well, that's interesting. Maybe he should have let us go to work when this whole thing started with the mask, because frankly, we're not even anywhere near the level of infection and recovery required for herd immunity in the state of Kentucky. So basically, this disease is at the same state it was 6 weeks ago. We should have all been going to work with the mask on.
So do you feel that the shutdown was a mistake?
The government should have never been shut down in Kentucky to the degree that it was. The economy should have never been shut down in Kentucky to the degree that it was.
Okay. How fast do you think it will take for the country to return to normal?
We're going to be feeling the effects of this economic shutdown, not for weeks, not for months, but for years. We have damaged a lot of small businesses. A lot of jobs aren't going to come back. A lot of these restaurants aren't going to reopen. No amount of stimulus money keeps a business whole when they don't have customers.
What did the government do well? What were the successes in your mind in terms of the response?
Maybe the only thing the government did that was smart was to curtail travel from foreign countries where the virus was at a high rate. But the problem there is even that they screwed up. You were able to come to the United States from China if you connected in a country like Africa. So really, I'm having a hard time finding anything that the government has done well in this scenario.
What do you think is the biggest failure of the government through all this?
The biggest failure is shutting down our economy and making it so that people couldn't go get health care. Look, you can't get an elective procedure done in Kentucky. People are avoiding the doctor's offices and the hospitals. How many cases of diabetes and cancer and heart disease have gone without a diagnosis here in the last 6 weeks? We all know that diagnosing those conditions early is the key to treating them.
It's interesting you should say that, because we did a story, my colleague, the health reporter, did a story about how they're begging people, if you're sick or you're hurt, go to the emergency room, it's safe, because people are scared that they're not going. And they said that cancer diagnoses are down 30 to 40% year over year. And it isn't that people don't get cancer. It's just they don't want to go to the hospital because they're either scared or they can't, which I thought was a telling statistic. Do you think kids should be going back to school? The president apparently was telling governors, or asking governors, to reopen school before the end of the school year. Obviously, it's a state-by-state thing, but do you think they should be allowed to go back to school, or do you think we should wait till the fall?
You know, the mandatory school shutdowns never should have happened. You had kids that relied on the school to get a hot meal that day. You had parents who relied on the school, frankly, for daycare because they needed to go to work. And so when they shut the schools down, that's when they really started imposing pain on individuals. What they should have done is made school optional. And what you probably would have had is about 20 or 30% attendance. And it would have been those kids who needed the meal. It would have been from the middle class or single moms who needed the daycare that school provides. That's what we should have done. If you could go back to that now, that would be smart. Make school optional so that there's a place where kids can go. And by the way, you can maintain social distancing in a school if there's only 30% attendance. But, you know, I don't know what they're going to do now, but there's plenty of time to get everything in place to open school back up in August and September, and there's no excuse not for doing that.
Right. I think what the question was, do you think we should try to get kids to be able to finish out school in May and June this school year? Obviously, the governor's already said that's not going to happen in Kentucky, but other states are possibly considering it, or the president was trying to get governors to consider it. So that's what that was the impetus for the question.
Right. I think I answered it.
Yeah, you did.
My solution would have been my solution for the rest of the school year is what it should have been to start with, which is to make school optional so that the kids who needed a hot meal and the single moms who needed the daycare that school provides could send their kids to school. If you had 20 or 30% attendance, then you could have spaced them out and had social distancing at school.
So do you think that the kids that stayed home should be allowed to also learn virtually if they wanted to? Keep online classes going?
It should be optional, but we've got these stupid, crazy laws that say if you don't have 80% attendance, then your school doesn't get any funding. And we should have suspended that regulation immediately when this virus started.
How much further do you think the federal government should go to assist states and local governments?
Well, there's an argument to be made that the government is the one that's been depriving people of their livelihoods, and so that the government should make those people whole. And I'm sympathetic to that argument. The problem is you have the governors shutting down their own economies while you have the federal government trying to make people whole. Any further aid that comes from the federal government to the states, whether it's to the businesses or to their unemployment programs or to the governments, should be tied to opening their economies back up.
I guess the other side of that question is, Kentucky's a little different because the counties and the local governments rely more on property taxes than other places do. But like in Cincinnati and Ohio, the cities and the counties rely a lot on income tax and sales tax, which have obviously been decimated. So they're talking about laying off fire and police and public safety issues that they're going to be shorting on. And I think that's what they're saying. Hey, we need some help here. You guys shut down. You guys told us we needed to shut down. We shut down, but now we're out of money to pay firemen and so forth. What do you say to that argument? Do you think that, should the federal government also help? When we talked about helping small businesses and other industries, should they also help municipalities and state governments get whole?
Well, when Andy Beshear shut down our economy in Kentucky, my first thought was, hopefully this will be short-lived because eventually he won't get the revenue that he needs to pay the state employees. And that'll be a consequence of his own actions of shutting the state of Kentucky down for business. But what happened is the federal government stepped in and tried to provide a bridge, and that just encouraged Andy Beshear to go even further with the shutdown. What needs to happen is Andy Beshear needs to feel the consequences of the economic shutdown so that he can come up with more pragmatic policies for dealing with the virus while at the same time keeping our economy open. Look, we're going to have food shortages if we don't get the economy open back up soon.
I get that, but again, in many parts of the country, the cities and states are out of money because they don't have that revenue coming in, but they've got to pay. I know some would argue some state employees and some local employees aren't necessary, but you're also talking about garbage, sewer, fire, and police, and they're having to lay those people off. So, do you think that the government the federal government, Congress should step in and help those out?
Well, when you say the federal government should step in and provide this money, where does that money come from? It comes from the people that live and work in those states. The states are just as equipped as the federal government is to pay their employees. That's why we have it set up that way. The only difference is our federal government can print money. So if the question is, should we be printing money right now to bail the states out? The answer is no.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. And finally, do you think we're prepared if there's another wave of coronavirus, if it comes back at us? You think we're ready for that?
Well, what did the first wave look like in Kentucky? Where our hospitals weren't overwhelmed here in Kentucky, so it's a little odd to talk about a second wave in Kentucky.
Well, I mean, I know what you're saying through the prism of Kentucky, but you also hear the stories out of Seattle and New York and Boston, and those hospitals were overwhelmed for a while. I guess that's where the question comes from. Is, do you think as a country, not necessarily as a state, but as a country, do you think we're ready if we get another spike in cases?
The problem here is that it's not clear that what the government's doing is making people better off instead of making them worse off. And so to anticipate a second wave, I would have to anticipate a second wave of crushing economic sanctions imposed by governors on their own economies. And that's the second wave that I'm worried about. Look, people are going to the store and they're stocking up on food and toilet paper, not because they're afraid the virus is going to hit them. They're worried about the impending economic collapse that's been exacerbated by the government's response at the state level. It's wrong for the federal government to encourage states to engage in more of those punishing economic sanctions.
Anything else you wanted to add? That's all my questions. Anything else you wanted to add that I didn't ask?
I would just like to add that we're going to have food shortages. And what's ironic about that is you're also going to have farmers euthanizing animals at the same time. And that's already happening right now.
Where's the choke point? What is the choke point then?
So the problem is that farmers raise animals, and when you go to the grocery store, you don't go to the grocery store to buy an animal. You go to the grocery store to buy a package of meat. So there's a bridge between the farm and the consumer, and that bridge is the processing plant. Now, through overregulation, we've encouraged 4 companies to control all of the meat processing in the United States through large factories, and we've shut down our small processors, and we've overregulated them. And so that's a big problem now. We're seeing the consequences of making that farm to table process very brittle. it's breaking right in front of us. So I've got legislation in Congress to fix that. I've been warning about this for 5 years. I introduced a bill called the Prime Act, which would make it easier for local farmers to sell their meat locally using a local processor. These local processors exist. It's infrastructure that's out there. We need to start using it. They're inspected by health departments. They're subject to surprise inspections by the USDA, but they may not have a full-time USDA inspector there all the time. But look, restaurants don't have full-time USDA inspectors, and neither do the butcher shops in your grocery store. So it's ridiculous to make these mom and pop places that can process farm animals into food. It's ridiculous to make them have full-time USDA employees. So I've got a bill that says if you raise an animal in a state, butcher it in a state, and sell it in a state, then the federal government doesn't need to step in and over-regulate that process. I've got sponsors on the left side of the aisle, on the right side of the aisle, and in the House and the Senate, and it's time to pass this bill. It's called the Prime Act. In fact, Warren Davidson, one of the other local legislators, is a co-sponsor of that bill.
I'm talking to him in an hour. I'll ask him about it.
Great.
It's interesting you should say that. I did a story about local farmers, and I interviewed a cattle farmer in Grants Lick, and he was telling me that he can't, you have to buy it directly from him and then take it to a process. It sounded like a convoluted way to get fresh beef right from the farm, you know?
So,
and I had to go get it in my own processor, and they can only do it, you know,
that's right.
Because he's not USDA approved and all this other stuff. And I'm thinking, really, if I want to buy a side of beef, I got to go through all these hoops to be able to buy it. So
James, you can buy half a cow from a local farmer and use a local processor. The USDA will allow that, and nobody goes to jail. But if you buy a single package of hamburger using that process, somebody goes to jail for that. And it's ridiculous, and I'll tell you why. The argument is it's not safe to sell individual cuts of meat or to allow these local processors to do that. But I'm saying if you don't get sick eating half a cow, you're not going to get sick eating a hamburger from that half of the cow. And that's what my bill would allow. It would allow you to buy and sell individual cuts of meat from a local farmer using a local processor.
Is it time for the country to reopen?
You know, I think that it's a time for Ohio to reopen. And I think when you look at the situation around the country, you know, maybe New York City shouldn't reopen based on their data. But even when you look county by county data, there's a lot of places in the state of New York, for example, the hardest hit part of our country, that I'm confident feel that they could be reopening. And then when you look at Italy, and now that we've got a better data set from Italy, only 1.8% of the fatalities in Italy were people under 65. So I think you could manage the entire thing differently in almost every part of the country in terms of who is under subject to the stay-at-home order, maybe the most at-risk population, whether that's on age or underlying health condition. And you could have a much more involved, engaged economy and, frankly, civic life if you started to structure it differently.
How do you do that and balance the public health safety aspect of that, considering that there are experts saying that this could come back at us pretty strong if we're not careful?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can come back strongly if you're not careful, and I think you're going to be doing the same things. It's just a matter of who's doing them. Is it, is it everyone in America? I mean, really, is a county with 2 fatalities in it really supposed to react the same way as a county with 20,000 fatalities in it? That's not rational. And so I think you manage your risk based on the risk.
Okay. How long do you think it takes for us to get back to a sense of normal?
I think a lot's going to depend. After 9/11, everyone was obviously similar level of shock. Can't believe this just happened. What's actually going to happen after this? And thankfully, we had leadership at the time that was saying, you have to get back to normal. And the country united around that leadership. It wasn't a divisive time, at least for a few months. And I've been very disappointed that didn't happen in this case. I was somewhat surprised. Normally our country does come together. And I remember, when George W. Bush stepped out into Yankee Stadium and threw, arguably the best first pitch in baseball, people were nervous for him, like, wow, this is the president of the United States in the middle of a crowded Yankee Stadium, and he's going to throw out the first pitch. And then it was patriotic to go shopping. This was a different threat, a different enemy, but still some unknown risk. And thankfully, that risk was kept at bay. And we didn't see, not that there was no terrorism afterwards, but no other major acts of terror. And so a lot of activities went very much back to normal. And then on the other hand, we still don't fly the same way. There's a permanent structural change to some of our activities based off of that. So I think you'll see the same thing, but it really depends. What is that period after we get back to engaging in normal civic and commercial life? How does it turn out?
Right. Do you want to expound about that a little bit, about the lack of unity in a more divisive atmosphere? I mean, who do you think should shoulder the blame for some of that?
Well, I think, you can't really, you have to start first with yourself, do the best you can to set an example of it. I think, the president's tried to do that, and then I think gotten very frustrated with his press conferences. I mean, he's been incredibly transparent, but it's really just turned into, how can I be a piñata for people that are frankly here for their own agenda, which is largely to undermine the president, ridiculously so. And frankly, in the political discourse, the level of disagreement over things is shown in the final vote count. Very little disagreement, but to politicize and hold up a vote for 2 weeks, really for a handful of agenda items, and positioning, frankly, for this next round. That's a big part of why they canceled coming back to DC, is to try to continue negotiating remotely for a big bailout package for cities and states. And they like it that way because you don't have regular order. You don't have committee processes. You don't have hearings. You don't have a chance for the rest of the membership of Congress to represent their districts, offer amendments, have them debated, voted up or down. And that is exactly why Congress should lead by example and be fully functional.
So how much do you think the Congress and the federal government should step in to help cities and states at this point?
Yeah, I think they've already done a lot. I mean, in Ohio, I think we're closing in on $2 billion that's funded. I mean, for reference, the annual budget for Ohio is roughly $36 billion. So it's a pretty healthy dent. And the challenge has been not that they couldn't use more money. They don't have that high level of COVID-19 direct expenses. So they're asking for more flexibility for those dollars. So the question is, if that flexibility is granted, subject to a handful of conditions, can they use that money, and is that enough? And, Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer have said absolutely positively not. They want to make up for all the revenue shortfall in all the cities and states around the country. And that's a tremendous moral hazard. And for a lot of reasons. If you look at Ohio, we reformed our pension program because we weren't able to save enough to fully fund the promises that had been made. So there were reforms, and so there were additional savings. Now Ohio's made these reforms, and we have a rainy day fund. We've been put on good fiscal footing, and other states haven't done that. So is it really states like Ohio that should bail out states like Illinois and New Jersey that refuse to do these things? And then down at the municipality level, I don't think the federal government should direct funds to any political subdivision of a state. I think the federal government should give money to states, and the states should resolve how they deal with their own municipalities.
Well, I mean, and as you know, in Ohio, the funding mechanism for those local municipalities is very much reliant on income tax or sales tax versus other states where it might be property tax. So a lot of cities in Ohio especially are saying, hey, this is all gone. 3 months from now, we're going to have no money coming in to pay our firefighters, our garbage men, our sewer workers, or our policemen. And we're going to have to lay those people off, those vital services off. You can argue about, some of the other departments the city may or may not have, but they're talking about possibly having to cut public safety and public service. And so they're saying, yeah, I need the flexibility, but we're going to need to replace some of that revenue. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, that is true, and they should talk to their state governors. I think the state legislature should deal with the cities and states that way. And I think the other thing I think about is, that when there's a problem for a school, they don't normally go, we need more money. They don't go, oh, we're going to have to scale back on some of these other things. They go, oh, we're going to cut busing and sports, the pain points, right? So they're not looking at, gee, we might have to scale back on the bike paths or, the free concert series or things like that, which are nice things to have, but they're not essential, like the fire department, for example. So they go first to the most politically sympathetic thing, and they don't really look at the reforms. And I think that's why it has to be done at the state level. It shouldn't be done from Washington, D.C. for any state. And I think the states will get it largely right. I mean, I'm sure there'll be a healthy fight in Ohio, in the Ohio legislature about how they should fund these things inside the state, but that's the right place for that to take place, not in Washington, D.C.
What have been the biggest successes by the government during this epidemic? And what have been the biggest failures by the government?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's the first time I've been asked that one during this period. And, I think you're going to look back on this period. It's going to be, plenty of PhDs written on this topic, whether it's a public health perspective, a historical perspective, economics, you name it, in terms of the field of how it's done. And I looked at the reaction, and we went really from, early, let's wait and see where this goes, to dramatic, let's shut virtually everything down. And so we kind of blew past the more measured approach that was done in, say, Japan, where you put more vulnerable people under, restrictive orders, but you kept broadly the rest of society functioning more normally. We really blew through that. So I think that's one of the big mistakes potentially, but we'll see. You're always going to have this debate that isn't going to be easily resolved, which is, see, it worked. We did these really draconian things and it worked amazingly well. And on the other hand, a lot of people will always say and feel just as validated that, you guys overreacted and look what was caused. And so I feel for the governors who've had to bear this weight almost entirely. It's almost all executive action. And then as a legislator, that's one of my big concerns is the legislatures around the country have largely deferred to executive authority. And, they may very well have agreed completely with their governors, and in which case the governor wouldn't have felt quite as lonely. They would have had some reinforcement. But then they may have disagreed. And in Michigan, they did. They took action and took back some of the authority. And I think they were right to do that in Michigan.
I live in Kentucky, actually, and it's been a interesting dance to watch the Republican-controlled legislature deal with the Democratic governor who's getting all of the attention.
Well, and not just some of the attention's good and some's bad, right? And so in Kentucky, when you're literally going around citing people for going to church, you didn't have that in Ohio. I mean, that was a clear, to me, overreach. These are the kinds of things the Department of Justice is right to look into. Look, every elected official I've talked to wants to protect public health, and virtually everybody wants to grow the economy. It's a matter of timing, of when to get the economy back to good health, or how to do it, or whatever. But every single one of us swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And so for some of the elected officials around the country to say that, the Bill of Rights is above my pay grade, as an example in New Jersey, is not just shocking. I mean, it's reprehensible. And to me, the governor of Indiana was essentially thumbing his nose at that by literally citing people for deciding to go to a church service, even when that service was planned to be socially distant.
You're talking about Kentucky,
ways that were compliant, right? In Kentucky, right?
Do you think kids should be going back to school before the end of the school year, or should we wait until fall before we let them back into school?
Well, I think the same thing. You should have a uniform standard, and if you can comply with that, I think you could make decisions on how to do that personally. But I was really encouraged to hear the governor offer some support for graduation ceremonies. United States Air Force Academy got some great press out of continuing their mission to graduate new Air Force officers out of the Air Force Academy. They did it in a socially distant way, and it was an amazing, pretty inspiring ceremony. The United States Military Academy, my alma mater at West Point's got plans to do something similar on June 13th. And I just hope that all the graduates from high school, from college, from community colleges, have a chance to celebrate that. And if they can do that in a way that accommodates the legitimate public health concerns of our time, then I think they should be able to do it.
But graduation ceremonies aside, what about just regular classroom activities?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think one of the most difficult decisions that the governor wrestled with was this line of essential versus non-essential businesses. My personal view is I wish we had looked at a way to simply put out a set of standards. And there will always be debate about which standards. We just saw the governor retract his face covering position from today due to overwhelming public feedback that they didn't want to have to do that. It's like, well, I've gone to Kroger without a face covering since this whole thing began, but now all of a sudden I have to, as an example. But if there was a uniform policy that said if you can maintain physical distance and sanitation standards and time off for your workers if they feel sick or have been exposed, and you put that out, it really shouldn't matter what kind of business. I think this idea of essential versus non-essential activities is really, it's been harmful. I mean, the idea that you can go to Walmart and buy a bike, but you can't operate a bike shop on Main Street doesn't really make sense to me. Or the idea that Amazon can deliver, artificial flowers to your door, but a local flower shop can't deliver flowers to your door.
Do you think the marketplace is eventually going to decide this? The reason I bring this up, a friend of mine from Georgia, who's also a journalist, interviewed a restaurant owner who he thought would be one of the first to want to open when the governor there reopened the state. And instead, this restaurant owner said, I talked to my customers and none of them are going to come, so why bother opening?
Yeah, and I think that's freedom. I mean, when you're free to do that, then that's a rational choice. And I've talked to a lot of business owners the same. I mean, I think people are rightly modeling their business. I mean, someone was talking to me about, well, Honda's not talking about opening up for a month. I'm like, if I were the CEO of Honda, I wouldn't open up until people start buying cars. Why do you need to make cars if nobody's buying cars? So when does the consumer, for the economy to recover, consumers have to be confident, they have to be knowledgeable and confident about their health risks and the risks that they're going to pose to their friends, families, and neighbors. And for the workforce to be present in any of those places, they're going to have to feel safe as well. And so for the employers out there, the business owners, they have to know they've got a customer base and that they've got a workforce that is going to make their business viable.
I talked to my boss last night because I'm in the office right now, but this is only the second time in a month that I've been here. And they want us all working from home. And I asked him, I've got a makeshift desk that it's not great for my back. And I said, how much longer are you looking at this short term? He said, what do you mean by short term? And I said, months. Are you looking at months before we all come back in the office? He said, well, quite frankly, we've learned that we can do things without having everybody in the office for the first thing. But then for the second thing, yes, you're going to be out of this office for months until this all goes away. And so I'm thinking, oh, okay, they're taking this like it's going to be a long-term thing, like not until the fall before we're all back in the one building. I was asking him for a piece of office equipment so I could.
Right. Yeah.
But that was the whole point of the conversation was that, okay, like you said, businesses are having to deal with this and a lot of them they don't want to get sued. They don't want to get their employees sick. So they're going to be taking their time with it, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that's wise for business leaders to do that. And I think it'd be wise for the legislature to look at, what are the things that make the workforce feel safe, well accommodated in their workplace. And frankly, for business owners, what kind of liability assurances do they need to feel like they've done what they were asked to do? They've used they can't be grossly negligent. No one's going to give them a pass on that. But there are people literally in fear. There's trial lawyers roaming about, looking for people with deep pockets to go after. Nothing new about that, but the circumstance presents lots of opportunities for that. So I think legislatures would be wise to provide clear liability guidance in a state-by-state basis, because most of the civil liability cases are state cases. I've called for the same sort of thing at the federal level. Andy Biggs from Arizona has got a bill that, I think is a good start. I haven't committed to co-sponsor it yet, but studying it. But the topic, I think, is going to be relevant, and it's going to be relevant from a worker safety. We already addressed that with OSHA, right. And I think we're going to continue to look at reforms that passed in earlier phases of the OSHA reforms. So I think we're going to continue to look at these things at the federal level, and I'm certain that state legislatures will start looking at that. That's just, to me, why I think it's important that the legislatures get back in session and are fully functional. I mean, maybe they work differently as well, but they should be fully functional. There are a lot of issues that really do need clarity and not just force of executive authority, but real laws.
Hey, last two questions. First of all, I about an hour ago, I did the same thing with Congressman Massie from Northern Kentucky, and he mentioned that you're a co-sponsor on his Prime bill. I think it's called the Prime bill, about meat processing, and didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. And then the final question is, are we ready if we have a second wave of this? Do you think we could handle it, knowing what we know now after the first wave?
Well, I think they're both good questions, and I think one of the most important things to answer that either way is the food supply chain. And Thomas Massie's bill's been around since well before the COVID-19 situation. In Wyoming, they finally got the first state to move forward at the state level, even without this federally passed bill, to basically let local processors sell in state. And what that does is, without an FDA person on site, they can't function in these processing facilities. And because that is a federally regulated interstate commerce issue, what the Prime Act says, well, we take the interstate commerce piece out. If you're selling in state, then it's no longer a federal jurisdiction piece. It doesn't excuse people from any state liability issues. There are state laws in every state that relate to food safety. But it would make it so that, say, a local rancher could have a path to sell the meat from his cattle or hogs or poultry that could go to market in that sense, versus just literally being slaughtered and wasted because you can't operate the supply chain.